this one must be very profound. The Ethics of Aristotle. Now, anybody that read that must believe he's a cut above anybody that hadn't. See, it's no good, Montag. We've all got to be alike. The only way to be happy is for everyone to be made equal. So, we must burn the books, Montag.
We want to be free. We want to be free to do what we want to do. We want to be free to ride. We want to be free to ride our machines without being hassled by the man. And we want to get loaded.
Believe me, if I started murdering people, there'd be none of you left. Because my children are coming. I told you 20 years ago.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
In my way of thinking, without judgment, you might as well be dead. Your brain is, so why not the rest of you? We were talking about marijuana. We still are. Marijuana is the flame, heroin is the fuse, LSD is the bomb. So don't you try to equate liquor with marijuana, mister, not with me.
Pop your culture.
All right, it is time to do this. Welcome, everybody. This is Pop Your Culture on Radio Gordo and on Cheer FM. And as this show goes out initially on, well, I guess technically as we now really look at it, being that it's midnight on June 4th, it's 2 days past the anniversary, the 9th anniversary of the passing of the man to whom this show is dedicated. This week's show is dedicated to Alexander Theodore, quotations, Sasha Shulgin, born on June 17th, 1925, passed away on June 2nd, 2004. He was a man of towering influence in the world of psychedelics. He had an extensive amount of work in the field of psychedelic research. He was really into what has been called rational drug design for psychedelic drugs. And because of all of that, he is dubbed the godfather of psychedelics. Now, this man was basically his biggest impact on the world of world of psychedelics and pathogenics and theogenics is essentially that of introducing MDMA, methyl dioxymethamphetamine, aka ecstasy, the drug that fueled rave culture in the late 80s and early 90s, synthesized this compound and got it out to some incredibly influential people in the 1970s who started to found an entire field of research into psychiatry and the psychological work with couples using this compound and allowing it to be an empathogenic. So instead of most classic psychedelics are essentially entheogenic, so entheos, basically like the spiritual component of it, whereas MDMA being a different substance is more of the, not like MDA, which was commonly known as the love drug in the 1970s, which if you're here in the southwest coast of British Columbia, there's a character from Vancouver Island called the Wizard of Ladysmith, who was a massive purported manufacturer of MDA back in the 1970s. Different substance. So MDMA is a little bit different. It's the one that, as I was saying, is part of the rave culture. Alexander Shulgin is the guy who spent time working for Dow Chemical, did some stuff for them, made money, and got out, and then chased his chemistry, basically knowledge, his desire to learn more, and he really did get fun and enjoyment out of tweaking chemicals. He would draw these compounds and he would move things around and figure out new ways to create these keys. As he talks about it in some interviews, he didn't really see himself as a drug chemist. he thought of himself more as a tool maker. He would develop tools to be used so people could learn to understand the human mind better, which is a really interesting approach. He wasn't quite a proselytizer for a psychedelic culture like, say, Terence McKenna. He wasn't necessarily a poet like Dale Pendle, the author of Pharmacognosis and Pharmacopoeia and Pharmacodynamics, basically the Pharmaco series, really cool series of books, and we actually do have an interview with him later. He wasn't necessarily the same kind of guru as maybe someone like Alan Watts, and we'll hear from him later. But I think one of the best places for us to start in this show, dealing with Alexander Shulgin and acknowledging the 9th anniversary of his passing, is an interview that I have here in which he talks about MDMA, probably his greatest claim to fame. So, as all things need to start somewhere, this is where Pop Your Culture starts this week.
The stepfather of Rabe's favorite pharmaceutical lives in the hills behind San Francisco. In the early 60s, Dr. Alexander Shulgin was one of the Dole Chemical Company's top analytical chemists. He turned his skills to making psychoactive drugs. It cost him his job, but turned him into a folk hero to the rave generation. In the mid-1960s, he resynthesized an obscure drug that had been patented but then ignored by the German company E. Merck in 1911. It was called 3,4-methylene dioxy-N-methylamphetamine, MDMA for short. It would later acquire the street name ecstasy. To Dr. Shulgin, it was just one of hundreds of mind-altering drugs he concocted and tested on himself and his close friends.
Actually, it's about 40 years ago. I started with a drug that is an isolate from a cactus called mescaline. And it was an 8-hour experience. My curiosity was if such a simple molecule can allow me this type of openness, the so-called psychedelic experience, what modifications that molecule will modify, improve, change, redirect that type of introspection. And hence that became my research search. Ah, magnificent. This is my first effort to make the product, and I have starting material and product left.
Today, in his garden shed laboratory, Dr. Shulgin is synthesizing what he hopes will be a brand new psychedelic substance. In the weeks to come, he will try it in larger and larger doses and assess whether or not the trips it will produce are worth taking.
I rather suspect it would be a visual distortion, maybe color exaggeration, wiggly lines, moving patterns. I would not expect it to rob you of awareness of your reality and where you are and your relationship with it. And the graphs down here.
Around 20 years ago, Dr. Shulgin made these careful notes.
Just over an hour.
The first recorded experience on ecstasy.
This is one of the early studies on MDMA. I called it N-methyl-MDA at the time. And let me get my glasses so I can read. Here they are. 16 milligrams, that was in 1976. Actually, the first trial in that particular guise was on a train trip going from here to Reno. There was a thing called the Fun Weekend, or the Fun Reno train, and I went with my late wife and 2 very good friends, and we very often would take our own meals with us, and we'd eat on the train with the fun of having a tablecloth and a candelabra and lox and all the pleasures instead of a sandwich. And not at all uncommon, we did then have a martini or an alcohol as a prelude to dinner. And I asked if they would mind if I tried a chemical in its place. 25 milligrams, no effect. 40, no effect. 60 milligrams, no effect. 81 milligrams, I got a +1. 53 minutes smooth shift into a light intoxication, distinct, almost early alcohol-like intoxication. And I'd find that I would blend very nicely into the gregariousness, into the disinhibition of the cocktail hour. So I looked upon it as a possible low-calorie martini, or no-calorie martini.
Dr. Shulgin mentioned the drug's effects to a therapist friend. He and others were enthusiastic. They felt its ability to induce friendliness and empathy would be ideal for treating people with relationship problems. Dr. Shulgin believes thousands were given the drug, often by qualified practitioners, until it was banned in America in 1985.
One of the areas in which Sasha Shulgin, Sasha wasn't his real name, his name was Alexander Shulgin, but everybody called him Sasha Shulgin. One of the ways in which he's basically made his lasting imprint on the world of psychedelics, besides the creation of everything, is 2 books that he wrote with his wife, Anne Shulgin. He was the chemist and she was the author more so. Did a tremendous amount of work together. We have an interview later on in the show in which both of them are interviewed, and they talk about the differences and sort of compare phenethylamines and tryptamines, and that so happens to be where they managed to have such a lasting input into this world. 2 books that they published. The first one in 1991 was called PCAL, or Phenethylamines I Have Known and Loved, which was followed up by the second edition, Tryptamines I Have Known and Loved. Now, these books ended up causing trouble for Shulgin. He actually had a license from the DEA in order to basically work with Schedule 1 controlled substances, which all the most dangerous, as maybe put air quotes around that, all the most dangerous drugs, according to the Drug Enforcement Administration, anything without any kind of redeeming value is essentially put into the Schedule 1. Shulgin had the ability to work with these compounds. The DEA would consult with him. He was an incredibly knowledgeable individual, lived in the West Coast, and he would attend court cases where he would give factual information. Now, with the publication of Phenethylamines and Tryptamines I Have Known and Loved, he got himself in trouble, and despite having essentially scheduled inspections in the past, he was raided at his home. The entirety of his laboratory was essentially told to be essentially confiscated. He came under this fire because, as some DEA agents were reporting, was that in every single drug lab that they started busting after the release of those 2 books, you were able to find them in every drug lab, as each book essentially had a how-to guide recipe book portion on how to create the incredible list of chemicals that he discovered and created. A lot of these things weren't even illegal at the time that he created them. They were research chemicals. They were so new that the government couldn't even keep all of them scheduled into like class 1 or anything like that by the time that he created. There's a whole subsection of the drug culture called, basically people are into RCs, research chemicals, and these are the chemicals that they're not illegal yet. They also don't have any kind of a safety data sheet. And amazingly enough, that was one of the things that Shulgin worked to do. He tested all the chemicals he created on himself in increasing doses to find the effect of them. He actually had a group of friends that would join him on some of these experiments, and they would try them out. The man created his own safety data sheets. Pretty wild. Now, let's check out a little bit of music. We're going to do 2 songs from Queens of the Stone Age, going back to their 2000 release, Rated R. We have Better Living Through Chemistry standing by. But first up, Feel Good Hit of the Summer.
You can see it value of Vicodin, marijuana, ecstasy, and alcohol. You can see the value of Vicodin, marijuana, ecstasy, and alcohol. You can see the value of Vicodin, marijuana, ecstasy, and alcohol. Oh, you can see the value.
in a perfect example of how sometimes rock and roll can tie into a theme of a show, those were two songs from Queens of the Stone Age going back, 23 years now to 2000's outing Rated R. Queens of the Stone Age, definitely a band that is not altogether unfamiliar with states of altered consciousness, and very well indicated on those two songs that we heard. From them, we had Better Living Through Chemistry and Feel Good Hit of the Summer. The lyrics to Feel Good Hit of the Summer are nicotine, Valium, Vicodin, marijuana, ecstasy, and alcohol. Cocaine. We're talking some like Milton, Shakespearean kind of levels of writing there on that one, right? Right. Anyways, let's bring this back around to maybe something approaching a level of being just slightly more serious once again. This is the, of course, Alexander Shulgin Memorial Special, Sasha Shulgin, as he was fondly known. Shulgin, along with his wife, Anne Shulgin, as I mentioned earlier, wrote two books, P-Cal and T-Cal. Phenethylamines I Have Known and Loved, and T-Cal, tryptamines I Have Known and Loved. Both books actually reside on a couple of special shelves within my own personal library. These books just indicate what a towering figure the man was in, and I'm almost loath to use this terminology, but the drug scene. His contribution to science and as a tool maker, which he really looked at himself as being, is grossly undermined by just saying as part of drug culture. The data that he created, along with the chemicals that he created that data for, is pretty amazing. The chemicals that he's brought into the world, which a large number of people have found positive use with, the psychological impact of MDMA in therapeutic sessions. I mean, this is a field of research that is ongoing to this day. So MAPS is an incredible organization that is doing a lot of research into the field of PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. MAPS stands for Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Study. There's a Canadian charter. Of course, it was started in the US, and they've been using MDMA, which is the chemical for which Shulgin has received greatest prominence in his career. That is an amazing impact. The research that they're showing as well in treating PTSD has been incredibly positive. So used within not necessarily the party framework through which ecstasy, which is essentially the street name of MDMA, as it became known for the rave scene, when used in a proper therapeutic setting, it's showing tremendous possibility and potential for actually alleviating people's issues when they suffer with things like PTSD. And largely we have someone like Alexander Shulgin to thank for that. So let's take a moment and appreciate that. Next up in the show, being that we're going to take a holistic approach to this and include a lot of authors and writers and thinkers who are part of this whole scene, subgenre, and everything like that. Well, let's hear a little bit from Alan Watts. This was a bit of a freaky dude who passed away in November of 1973. He brought a lot of concepts of Eastern philosophy and Eastern teachings to people in North America. And I find a kinship with him, if I might be so bold, because he essentially gained his following while working as a volunteer programmer at a radio station in Berkeley called KPFA. So I appreciate that. I might be bold and, as I say, feel a bit of a kinship. If what I present here helps people, that's very cool. This is Alan Watts talking about our natural desire to explore psychedelics.
Substances such as mescaline, which is the derivative of peyote, or a chemical synthesis of the same thing that is in peyote, is not a narcotic. LSD is not a narcotic. Psilocybin is not a narcotic from the mushroom. And cannabis is not a narcotic. Because these substances tend to do something very different from producing sleep. They tend instead to produce a peculiar kind of wakefulness. a sharpening rather than a dimming of consciousness. And so they must not be lumped in the same category as things which are true narcotics. And I would say it would be part of the definition of a true narcotic, that is, it is also addicting, as alcohol is addicting, as the opiates are addicting, that you become dependent on them and only with great difficulty can shake them off. The same is true, of course, of tobacco. It is very difficult for a hardened smoker to drop it, and it is therefore addicting, although I doubt whether it is actually a narcotic in the sense of a sleep-inducing thing or an insensitive, something that makes you insensitive. Now, our absurdly paranoid government agencies have never learned in 50 years how to handle these problems. Despite the lesson of prohibition, the authorities still think that the only way to deal with even dangerous narcotics is simply to suppress them, not clearly realizing that this makes them all the more attractive and that it creates an enormous crime problem which without suppression would not exist. Because the minute you suppress something and it becomes illegal, people know that there must be something extremely exciting about it. And it's very difficult to suppress these things. And you can suppress it a little bit. In other words, you can pick out a few fall guys and make terrible examples of them by electrocuting them or putting them in prison for an incredible number of years. But this invariably only scratches the surface, because when something wrong or illegal is really popular, there is no way of suppressing it, because all the hotels in the United States would not be sufficient to jail all the criminals involved. This has never worked. And why people don't learn from history is beyond my comprehension. It becomes much worse as people become aware that there are an enormous number of varieties of things that will produce psychedelic effects, and that, in particular, such substances as LSD can be compressed into such small areas or volumes that their detection is virtually impossible. So the moment it becomes a racket and something, therefore, which organized crime can put a good price on, the possibilities of playing games with LSD are enormous. It's a real good racket. And all it will do, the suppression of it, is to encourage the proliferation of crime and lead to total nonsense. We have never really understood what control is. We don't see the difference between controlling oneself and strangling oneself. In other words, a person who is a controlled automobile driver is certainly not a person who has no car or keeps his car locked in the garage. A very controlled dancer is certainly not a person who never dances. The control of things is not the suppression of them, but their use in a sensible and proper way. And this has not penetrated the consciousness of our authorities. You cannot suppress sex. You cannot suppress mankind's fascination, curiosity, for whatever motive, in other states of consciousness than the normal. These things are eternally fascinating to human beings and will always be pursued.
The unifying concept was that these things were actually a blend of both matter and mind. They were substances, to be sure, but ones in which the future and distant places could be seen, in which anything imaginable, even language itself, literally became visible. Someone unfamiliar with such chatter would have regarded these ideas as extremely odd, if not plain crazy. But as I've described, Terence and I were already steeped in an exotic conceptual stew comprising alchemy, Jungian psychology, ceremonial magic, shamanism, yoga, and science fiction. To some degree, this was also true of our companions. Besides, our analytical categories were pretty loose to begin with. We were anything but rigorous reductionists, even if we might have kidded ourselves that we were scientists. So to us, these ideas weren't that strange. Could the body really produce a substance that was a fusion of matter and mind, and that contained metalinguistic idea complexes that could only be comprehended in a state of profound tryptamine intoxication? We had no problem with that. In our state, that concept made perfect sense. And whatever powers the mushrooms may have given us in the service of great conversation, reductionist rigor and skepticism weren't among them. On the contrary, the mushrooms encouraged the wildest intellectual fantasies, as if egging us on to ever more outlandish scenarios. We heatedly discussed the parallels between alchemical fluids and crystals and shamanic phlegm. We also explored the role played by sound in evoking these phenomena. Anyone who has smoked DMT can testify that sounds heard inside the head are a prominent part of the experience. Sometimes the sounds are like ripping cellophane. Sometimes they are more like electrical sounds, buzzing, popping, and humming noises. Not uncommonly, similar sounds are often heard on high doses of mushrooms. As Terence noted, DMT seems to trigger glossolalia and other forms of spontaneous vocalization. Once the interior sound is perceived, there is an impulse to imitate it with the voice, to sing along with it. The sound doesn't lend itself to imitation, but if one tries, the voice eventually seems to lock on to the inner buzz, which then pours out of one's mouth in a long, powerful ululation that is quite alarming and unlike any sound one would ordinarily utter. And making the sound is cathartic. It triggers an almost orgasmic ecstasy, and it greatly stimulates the closed eyelids visual phenomena. There is a precedent for this in the traditions of ayahuasca shamanism as well. The icaros, the healing songs sung by ayahuasqueros, are used to evoke the inner visions and thereby direct the inner journey. There is apparently a tight link between the icaros and the inner visions and the manifestation of these fluid psychosubstances. Our conversations revolved around these heady ideas night after night as we communed with our new companion, and by then we did have a sense of being in the presence of an other, an entity of some kind that was fully participating in the conversation, though in a nonverbal or perhaps metalinguistic way. We came to think of this other as the teacher, although it was unclear whether that meant the mushrooms themselves or if the mushrooms provided a channel for communicating with some unidentified entity. Whatever it was, the teacher was full of interesting suggestions about how our investigation should proceed. We began to think pure logos had taken physical form, that is, manifested itself as a substance composed of mind, of language, of meaning itself, yet all somehow grounded in a biological substrate. We used the term translinguistic matter to describe this mysterious substance, and we speculated that somehow it was produced in the peculiar state created by ingesting tryptamines. We figured this matter was psilocybin or DMT that had been, quote, rotated through the fourth dimension so that its trip was on the outside of the molecule.
That was Dennis McKenna, brother of Terence McKenna. Dennis McKenna there reading an excerpt from his book, Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. I had the personal pleasure of meeting Dennis McKenna at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference held at UBC in the year 2014. Of course, that was the same year that Shulgin passed away. It was amazing, actually, meeting Dennis McKenna and having a conversation with him. Actually, I had a few conversations with him over the weekend. fanboyed out a little bit, and I got a picture of myself and Mr. McKenna, and he signed my book. Actually, I do have a copy of Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, and he signed that one for me. Another one in my collection on the shelves, not too far from PCAL and TCAL. But we had some really interesting conversations with compounds that don't really come up in the rest of this show, but we were talking about salvia and ketamine as being really interesting tools as well. Salvia, the main component, active component, is salvinorin A. It's an interesting compound in that it doesn't work on the serotonergic systems like tryptamines do, or phenethylamines, and it really shouldn't be. It's not a classical psychedelic, but it offers some of the strongest reported psychedelic experiences that a person can have. And then there's something like ketamine, which is much like MDMA, is being used in clinical studies through organizations like MAPS to treat long-standing, and in this case, really persistent chronic issues of depression. Now, ketamine is kind of widely known as a party drug, used as an anesthetic. But an interesting thing with something like ketamine is it has one of the best safety profiles of anything that could be used as an anesthetic. It was widely used in Vietnam in the field because of its ability to be an anesthetic and a sedative, but not suppress breathing function, which is one of the most dangerous aspects of most opioid-based anesthetics and pain relievers. So really tremendous impact with that. And ketamine does have a really strongly reported psychedelic aspect to it. Now, one of the reasons that you don't hear about it necessarily a whole lot when it's used in valid use, which is in veterinary science, animals aren't going to give you a trip report. Humans will. But there have been cases where it's being issued nasally in solutions with patients who have chronic depression, and it's showing an interesting effect with some of these patients. I don't have all the data sets behind me. This is just stuff that I've read over the years, and it's coming out of my own head, but research that has shown that one of the reasons why it's been apparently really popular or is showing promise in dealing with chronic depression with a lot of individuals is it is when used at higher doses, it most closely represents a near-death experience, given essentially some of the broader definitions of the near-death experience. But it's almost like it turns the switch in the brain that kind of, and almost to use a tech analogy here, it turns it off and on again. And that hard reset sometimes really helps patients. Pretty cool stuff. Now, in our next segment of the show here, I'm going to do 5 interview clips with Dale Pendle. Now, most of these are taken from the Spirit plant, or the DMT, the Spirit Molecule documentary. Now, Pendle is the author of the Pharmaco series, a 3-volume collection, which again is also sitting on my bookshelf. Great series. He devotes 1 to stimulants, 1 to inebriants, and 1 to the more classical psychedelics, which would be Gnosis. Pendle was an explorer and a poet. He spent a lot of time using all of these allies, as he calls them, on the, as he calls it, the poison path. And he learned to deal with the character and the personality of these substances. And he explains it really well in some of these clips. So let's check it out right now. 5 clips from Dale Pendle right here on Popular Culture on Radio Gordo and Cheer FM.
Start small, work your way up. It's a time-honored technique. And you get to know the terrain some, and try and I'm for active work in these fields rather than I don't know, listening to music, watching videos. One is so suggestible in some of these states and so open and so vulnerable. I don't like to give over that much. It's hard to find an artist that I trust enough to open myself up to them. Some, but there are there are a few people I will listen to in such states, but I try to be careful. And how much time you want to spend in I don't know, we're such a passive consumerist culture anyway. I really favor more active approaches. Try and see if you can get some. I mean, just as a challenge, bring something back from the ally. Get some words back. I call it dimensional smuggling. It's the art of bringing things across the frontier, getting words back. And the case is kind of the same for dreaming. You've got a great scene, you've picked up some great material, some great words, some great phrases, or some great visual scenes. And you can go further, but if you go further, you might forget then the first part, and how to bring it back into consciousness and still remember what was there. You've got to kind of time it just right to get the stuff back across. And then if you're really skilled, then you can drop back into the same state and pick up where you were and go a little further. Yeah, well, the whole point was that by immersion in each one, spending a lot of time with each plant, using it myself, it would find some way to tell its own story. So the book is kind of an illegitimate mix of chemistry and science, history, and poetry. And usually the voice of the plant spirit would speak through poetry in some way. Sometimes I developed what I call the back channel. Sometimes the ally, the plant ally. Some of them are talkative. Salvia divinorum's kind of talkative and has a sense of humor, and would have little kibitzing remarks after I would write something like, "Oh yeah, right." So I decided to leave that part in to try and catch a signature of the spirit. And as example, the stimulant chapters turned out being the longest and the most prosaic. The chapters on the hallucinogens maybe the most poetic. Maybe the most imagistic. So each chapter was really a long devotional to that particular plant, and I would just concentrate on it, focus on that plant or substance until the chapter was done, and each one would seem like the best one and my favorite one at the time. People have asked, what's your favorite, and I'm careful not to say, I like all my children. Yeah, I could. I don't know if I want to read the whole thing. It's in Pharmaconosis, and it's a play between. There's really three poems mixed together, and one is about Albert Hofmann and his graduation and training, and his work at Sandoz, and the other is about Gordon Wasson seeking out the mushrooms in Oaxaca, and then the third is about the Eleusinian mysteries, and they all kind of come together around das Mutakorn, the ergot alkaloids, the tolkorn, and the amazing day when Wasson sent Hofmann the Ololuqui seeds. that they were using there, morning glory seeds. And Hofmann analyzes them and finds out it's the same alkaloid he already has in his laboratory, lysergic acid. That kind of completed the circle that way. And I also have where Hofmann made the journey to Huautla to present his molecules back to Maria Sabina, an act of shamanic propriety. I kind of saved DMT for last. I kept postponing it year after year. I mean, it was kind of why I started the whole thing. I said, well, maybe I'll write the inebriants first. Yeah, well, maybe I'll do the stimulant section. Yeah, well, maybe I'll write the peyote chapter.
Yeah, it's not easy to talk about DMT.
Well, and there was the field work.
And the field work's even harder.
So, yes, I approach it. So I tell the story in Pharmacognosis of I wasn't anxious to meet Terence's elves, or really for any of it. Nor had been Terence, from what I hear. He only took it a handful of times and backed off when the entities began making demands. For me, DMT had always been too plastic, too celluloid, too much like a wild animated cartoon. If there is great meaning there, by now we should have some evidence from those who have frequented the realm. So I can't say my attitude was particularly positive, more the opposite. But in a word, I was desperate. I needed the goods. Scene, Faust study. Faust, who are you? Spirit. I am that light called the power of darkness. Faust, I can't see your face. Spirit, as I said, do you have a request? Faust, yes, I do. Spirit, what is it? You have come so far. Faust, I want the good lines. Spirit, that's easy for me. Faust, there is more. Spirit, what's that? Faust, they have to be true. Spirit, you do have a heavy request. Why not ask the powers of light? Faust, it would be too revealing. Spirit, do you fear revelation? Faust, no, I fear awe. Is that not seemly? Spirit, it is to my eyes. But then it would be, wouldn't it? Put the pipe to your lips. The amines are part of my realm. Smell them. I claim nitrogen, and thus the air. Faust, then is oxygen God? Spirit, oxygen is fire. Faust, and carbon? Spirit, earth. Faust, I follow you. So hydrogen is water. Spirit, etymologically it is incontestable. Faust, so what do you want from me? Spirit, you know. Faust, I already gave you that. Spirit, not good enough. Freely given, there is no contract. Faust, then show me. Spirit, apply the fire. Dear spirits of this molecule, many years have passed now on my quest to you. I've forgotten why I started. Some unfinished business between us. I'm not interested in cartoons, colors, or roller coasters anymore, nor in UFOs or extraterrestrials. Nonetheless, I have come the distance. I have survived, and now I am here. I hope I have not failed. You are the last of my pledges, and I wished to be relieved of any further obligation to record your words. I was complaining to Gary Snyder one day that everyone was trying to restrict use of psychedelics just for their particular group. The psychiatrist wanted to have control, that they could dispense them. Other group, I said, hey, everybody's trying to say that they're just for them. And Gary goes, they're right. They should be reserved for the poets. Albert Hofmann, at his 100th birthday, I was privileged to be able to go and deliver a poem I wrote for Albert on the making of Der Lycid, Das Mutterkorn, to him at his 100th birthday. And anyway, at his closing speech, his vision was that LSD would be dispensed in state-operated clinics. Now that is so alien to us and our experience. But what I took from it was that there are governments, countries, where people are not so thoroughly alienated from their government that such a thing is thinkable. State-operated clinics dispensing LSD. Interesting thought. I think the first thing to do is to call for a truce in the war on drugs and a prisoner exchange. We don't have anybody to exchange, but the exchange should go on anyway. Release the drug prisoners. A lot of people are doing exceedingly long sentences, 20, 30-year sentences for LSD. That's the crime. That's the crime of this generation, that so many people are behind bars for exploring their own consciousness. It would have been unthinkable to the framers of the Constitution that freedom of speech that exploring one's own consciousness needed specific protection. That would have been unthinkable to them. And here we have these people on the Supreme Court who claim to be, I don't know what, strict interpreters, original, how from original interpretation they get that, well, yeah, that gives the federal government the right to prosecute drugs even if the states say it's okay. I don't know. It shows the farce and the hollowness of their claims of strict interpretation. It's no such thing. It's a strict interpretation only when it suits them. So we need to stop putting people in prison. That's the first thing. And once we stop doing that and let the people out who are already in, maybe we can come up with some kind of gradual, rational way to deal with these things. It's not at all clear whether one should be experienced. We often hear that, you should have experienced people there, but, the kids seem to do pretty well with these things, actually. We all had our first time. Yeah. So, I don't know. I think especially now there's psychedelic experience is not what it used to be. Some people think the LSD has changed. It's not the LSD has changed. The culture has changed. And a lot of it has been, so much knowledge, consciousness, vibration has been absorbed into the general culture and passed on that the experience isn't going to be the same, The dosages are smaller, too. You get close to the same experience, if you pop a whole 10-strip.
Very similar to Terence McKenna. That was Dale Pendle. I actually find Pendle, personally, a little easier to listen to than Terence McKenna. Now, maybe it's a small, petty thing, but I like the sound of Pendle's voice more than that sort of nasally aspect that you could almost get from some of McKenna's speaking a little bit more. And Terence McKenna was definitely the orator, where his brother Dennis McKenna, whom we heard from earlier, is definitely more the scientist of the pair. Of course, McKenna passing away a number of years ago, 2001, I believe it was, if memory serves correctly. Dennis McKenna is still with us. Now, what we heard there from Dale Pendle was the last segment was called "Who Are These Drugs For?", which I think opens up a really interesting discussion when you start to look at maybe aspects of legalization. Now, recently, and I'm not sure how many of you out there maybe from British Columbia, let alone the Lower Mainland, with access to Vancouver and Granville Street in Vancouver, but I was recently in this past April on Granville Street, wandering around with some friends, just taking in the city. I mean, when you're from Vancouver Island, it's a big to-do to go to the big city. And walking around, we saw that there was a shop on Granville that sold magic mushrooms, both as dried mushrooms, in pre-made edibles, so chocolates. You could even find it in tinctures, a number of different preparations. And I was just actually talking to somebody earlier today, on the day that I'm recording this, how it was really weird to encounter a physical storefront selling magic mushrooms. And it reminded me very much of the years just prior to the legalization of cannabis in Canada. We are seeing a shift towards many of these materials becoming more widely available. And I think that conversation that Dale Pendle was talking about there at the end was kind of an interesting one, and maybe one that we're going to realistically and without hysteria need to have. Is it possible to say that one group is more deserving than another of access to these things? Should it just be wide open? Of course, there's going to be regulations in place, but will they be too restricting, or will they not be restrictive enough? These are interesting compounds. It's not like, and we often forget how much of a plant teacher cannabis can be simply by the sheer ubiquitous nature of it. It's all over the place. Experience with that particular plant teacher removes a lot of the hysteria and sort of mystique around it. You can kind of just see it as a sedative, but perhaps that's through overindulgence. Whereas, something like mushrooms, that's going to be a much different thing. So yes, who are these things for? That's going to be a conversation to have ongoing. Also in there before that from Pendle was an excerpt from the DMT, or an excerpt on DMT from the Pharmacognosis book. Pharmacognosis, just some of the writing and the way that it went into it. Different plants speak in different ways, and his first bit was advice to novices in psychedelics. And you know what? And that's probably some pretty good advice right there. Start small and work your way up. I think whether or not a person even agrees with people using these things, if you at least believe in a harm reduction approach, that sounds pretty darn sensible. All right, this is Popular Culture right here on Cheer FM and Radio Gordo. This week's show dedicated to the life, work, and influence of Alexander Sasha Shulgin, godfather of psychedelics. Another guy who's well known and incredibly outspoken on a number of topics which many consider taboo or at least inflammatory of conventional narratives is Graham Hancock. And this is an interesting piece that I've had in my collection for a while. I've been wanting to play it, and it's taken a little while to find the right location for it, and I think tonight we've found it. This is his banned TED Talk on the war on consciousness.
After 6 million years of boredom, the evolutionary ascent of our species from the last common ancestor with the chimpanzee, something extraordinary happened to us less than 100,000 years ago, which, by the way, is long after we'd become anatomically modern. It was a kind of emergence into consciousness less than 100,000 years ago, really less than 40,000 years ago, when we became fully symbolic creatures. And this great change has been defined as the single most important step forward in the evolution of human behavior, is intimately associated with the emergence of the great and transcendent rock and cave art all around the world. And over the last 30 years, researchers led by Professor David Lewis Williams at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa and many others have suggested an intriguing and radical possibility, which is that this emergence into consciousness was triggered by our ancestors' encounters with visionary plants and the beginning of shamanism. If you analyze the cave art, there's not time to go into the details here, but there are so many details that make it clear that this was an art of altered states of consciousness, of visions, and that plants like the Amanita muscaria mushroom or psilocybin mushrooms appear to have been directly connected with this sudden and radical change. So to investigate this possibility, when I got interested in this mystery, I went down to the Amazon, where there are still surviving shamanistic cultures today, and where they drink the powerful visionary brew ayahuasca, of which the active ingredient is dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which is actually closely related at the molecular level to psilocybin. Now, normally, DMT cannot be activated orally. When we encounter it in the West, it's generally smoked. There's an enzyme in our stomachs called monoamine oxidase, which switches off DMT on contact. But in the Amazon, they've got round this problem, and they say it was the spirits that taught them how to do it. The DMT in the ayahuasca brew is contained in these leaves from a plant that they call chacruna in the Amazon. And there they mix it together with this vine. And out of the 150,000 different species of plants and trees in the Amazon, this is the one that contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which switches off that enzyme in our stomachs and allows the DMT in the leaves, when the two are married together and cooked in water, to be absorbed orally and takes us on a 4-hour journey into extraordinary realms. Now, it's no joke to drink ayahuasca. The ayahuasca brew it has a foul taste, really, really hideous, and a dreadful, dreadful smell. And after you've drunk your cup, you'll find within 45 minutes or so that you're sweating, that you're feeling nauseous. Pretty soon you may well be vomiting, you may well have diarrhea. So, nobody's doing this for recreation. And I'd like to add that I don't think any of the psychedelics should be used for recreation. They have much more serious and important mission with humanity. So we're not doing this for fun. But what draws people to ayahuasca again and again to brace themselves for this experience, and you do have to brace yourself, is its extraordinary effects at the level of consciousness. And one of those effects has to do with creativity, and we can see the creative cosmogenic impulse of ayahuasca in the paintings of ayahuasca shamans from Peru, like the paintings of Pablo Amaringo here, those richly saturated colors, the amazing visions that they reproduce. And this creative impulse has also spread to Western artists. Many Western artists now have been deeply influenced by ayahuasca and are also painting their visions. And as these paintings show, another universal experience of ayahuasca is the encounter with seemingly intelligent entities which communicate with us telepathically. Now, I'm making no claim one way or another as to the reality status of these entities we encounter, simply that phenomenologically, in the ayahuasca experience, they are encountered by people all over the world. And most frequently of all, the spirit of ayahuasca herself, Mother Ayahuasca, who is a healer. And although she's kind of the mother goddess of the planet, She seems to take a direct personal interest in us as individuals, to heal our ills, to want us to be the best that we can possibly be, to correct errors and mistakes in our behavior that may be leading us down the wrong path. And this is perhaps why, and it's an untold story, really, ayahuasca has been fantastically successful in getting people off harmful addictions to hard drugs such as heroin and cocaine. Jacques Mabit at the Takiwasi Clinic in Peru brings heroin and cocaine addicts out there for a month, gives them 12 ayahuasca sessions, and they have encounters with Mother Ayahuasca during those sessions that lead them not to wish to take heroin or cocaine anymore, and more than half leave completely free of their addiction, never return to it, and don't even have withdrawal symptoms. And the same incredible healing work was being done in Canada by Dr. Gabor Mate until the Canadian government intervened and stopped his healing practice on the grounds that ayahuasca itself was an illegal drug. Now, I have some personal experience of this. I've not been addicted to heroin or cocaine, but I had a 24-year non-stop cannabis habit. And this started off smoking the herb and laterally vaporizing it, but the basic truth is that for 24 years, I was pretty much permanently stoned. And I enjoyed being stoned. And I felt that it helped me with my work as a writer, and perhaps at some point it did. But when I first encountered ayahuasca, I'd already been smoking cannabis for 16 years, and almost immediately, ayahuasca started giving me messages that this was no longer serving me, that it was leading me to behave in negative and unhelpful ways towards others. And of course, I ignored those messages for years and years and went back to being stoned 16 hours a day. But that negative behavior that ayahuasca was pointing up did actually get worse and worse. I don't want to put down cannabis, and I believe it's the sovereign right of every adult to choose to smoke cannabis if they wish to do so. But I think I was overusing it. I think I was abusing it, not using it responsibly. And I became more and more paranoid, jealous, possessive, suspicious. I was subject to irrational rages. I often made the life of my beloved partner, Santha, a misery. And when I went down for my regular encounter with ayahuasca in October 2011, I was given the most unbelievable kicking by Mother Ayahuasca. And I was put through an ordeal. It was a kind of life review. And it's not an accident that ayahuasca is the vine of the dead. I was shown my death. And I was shown that if I came to death and what awaits us after death, without having corrected the mistakes that I was making in my life, that it would be a very bad thing for me. And actually, Mother Ayahuasca literally took me to hell. And that hell was a little like this hell painted by Hieronymus Bosch, a truly terrible place, and a little like the place that the ancient Egyptians called the judgment hall of Osiris, where our souls are weighed in the scales in the presence of the gods against the feather of truth, of justice, of cosmic harmony. And I was shown that the path I was walking, my abuse of cannabis and the behavior associated with it, was going to lead me to be found wanting in the judgment, and that I might face annihilation in the world beyond death. So perhaps not surprising that when I came back to England later in October 2011, I gave up cannabis, and I've never smoked it again since then. And actually, and again, I'm speaking only personally with no comment on others' use of cannabis, it's as though a monkey has been lifted off my back. I'm liberated in incredible ways. Far from my creativity being inhibited, I find myself writing much more productively, much more creatively, much more focused, and much more efficiently as well. And I've begun to be able to address those negative aspects of my behavior, which cannabis had revealed, and hopefully to make myself slowly, it's a long progress, into a more nurturing, more loving, more positive person. And this whole transformation, it really has been a personal transformation for me, was made possible by this encounter with death that Mother Ayahuasca gave me. And you know, that leads me to ask, what is death? Our materialist science reduces everything to matter. Materialist science in the West says that we are just meat, we're just our bodies. So when the brain is dead, that's the end of consciousness. There is no life after death. There is no soul. We just rot and are gone. But actually, many honest scientists should admit that consciousness is the greatest mystery of science, and that we don't know exactly how it works. The brain's involved in it in some way, but we're not sure how. Could be that the brain generates consciousness the way a generator makes electricity. If you hold to that paradigm, then of course you can't believe in life after death. When the generator's broken, consciousness is gone. But it's equally possible that the relationship, and nothing in neuroscience rules it out, that the relationship is more like the relationship of the TV signal to the TV set. And in that case, when the TV set is broken, of course, the TV signal continues. And this is the paradigm of all spiritual traditions, that we are immortal souls temporarily incarnated in these physical forms to learn and to grow and to develop. And really, if we want to know about this mystery, the last people we should ask are materialist reductionist scientists. They have nothing to say on the matter at all. Let's go rather to the ancient Egyptians, who put their best minds to work for 3,000 years on the problem of death and on the problem of how we should live our lives to prepare for what we will confront after death. And the ancient Egyptians expressed their ideas in transcendent art, which still touches us emotionally today, and they came to certain very specific conclusions that the soul does survive death and that we will be held accountable for every thought, every action, every deed that we have lived through in our lives. So we better take this precious opportunity to be born in a human body seriously and make the most of it. And in these inquiries into the mystery of death, the ancient Egyptians weren't just exercising their imaginations. They highly valued dream states, and it's now known that they used visionary plants like the hallucinogenic blue water lily. And it's interesting that the ancient Egyptian tree of life has recently been identified as the Acacia nilotica, which contains high quantities of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, the same active ingredient that we find in ayahuasca. Now, it's difficult to imagine a society more different from the society of ancient Egypt than our society today. We hate visionary states in this society. In our society, if we want to insult somebody, we call them a dreamer. In ancient societies, that was praise. And we have erected huge apparatuses of armed bureaucracies who will invade our privacy, who will break down our doors, who will arrest us, who will send us to prison, sometimes for years, for possessing even small quantities of psilocybin or substances like DMT, whether in its smokable form or in the ayahuasca brew. And yet, ironically, DMT is, we now know, a natural brain hormone. We all have it in our bodies, and it's just that its function remains unknown for lack of research. And it's not as though our society is opposed in principle to altered states of consciousness. I mean, billions are being made by the unholy alliance of psychiatrists and big pharma in overprescribing drugs to control so-called syndromes like depression or attention deficit disorder in teenagers. And we have a love affair in our society with alcohol. We glorify this most boring of drugs, despite the terrible consequences that it often has. And of course, we love our stimulants, our tea, our coffee, our energy drinks, our sugar, and huge industries are built around these substances, which are valued because of the way they alter consciousness. But what all these approved altered states of consciousness have in common is that none of them contradict or conflict with the basic state of consciousness valued by our society, which I would call the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness, which is good for the more mundane aspects of science. It's good for the prosecution of warfare. It's good for commerce. It's good for politics. But I think everybody realizes that the promise of a society over-monopolistically based upon this state of consciousness has proved hollow, and that this model is no longer working, that it's broken in every possible sense that a model can be broken, and that urgently we need to find something to replace it. The vast problems of global pollution that have resulted from the single-minded pursuit of profit, the horrors of nuclear proliferation, the specter of hunger, that millions every night go to bed starving, that we can't even solve this problem despite our alert problem-solving state of consciousness. And look what's happening in the Amazon, the lungs of our planet, this precious home of biodiversity. The old-growth rainforest being cut down and replaced with soybean farms so we can feed cattle, so that we can all eat hamburgers. Only a truly insane global state of consciousness could allow such an abomination to occur. And I did a back-of-an-envelope calculation during the Iraq War. It seems to me that 6 months' expenditure on the Iraq War would have solved the problem of the Amazon forever, would be sufficient to compensate the peoples of the Amazon so that no single tree ever needed to be cut down again to garden and look after that amazing resource. But we can't make that decision as a global community. We can spend countless billions on warfare, on hatred, on fear, on suspicion, on division, but we can't get together the collective effort to save the lungs of our planet. And this is perhaps why shamans from the Amazon are now mounting a kind of reverse missionary activity. When I've asked shamans about the sickness of the West, they say it's quite simple. You guys have severed your connection with spirit. Unless you reconnect with spirit and do so soon, you're going to bring the whole house of cards down around your heads and ours. And rightly or wrongly, they believe that ayahuasca is the remedy for that sickness. And many now are being called to the Amazon to drink ayahuasca, and ayahuasca shamans are traveling throughout the West, offering the brew, often under the radar, often at personal risk, to bring about consciousness change. And it's true that the message of ayahuasca, the universal message, is about the sacred, magical, enchanted, infinitely precious nature of life on Earth and the interdependence of material and spiritual realms. And it's impossible to work with ayahuasca for long without being deeply and profoundly affected by this message. And let's not forget that ayahuasca is not alone, that it's part of an ancient worldwide system of the targeted, careful, responsible alteration of consciousness. It's recently been shown by scholars that the kykeon used in the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece was almost certainly a psychedelic brew, that the soma of the Vedas may well have been a brew based upon the Amanita muscaria mushroom. We have the DMT in the ancient Egyptian tree of life. We have the whole global cultures of surviving shamanism, and what it's all about is a state of consciousness that's designed to help us find balance, harmony. The ancient Egyptians would have called it Ma'at, with the universe, and to remain mindful that what we're here to undertake on Earth while immersed in matter is fundamentally a spiritual journey aimed at the growth and perfection of the soul, a journey that may go back to the very origins of what made us human in the first place. And I stand here invoking the hard-won right of freedom of speech to call for and demand another right to be recognized, and that is the right of adult sovereignty over consciousness. There's a war on consciousness in our society, and if we as adults are not allowed to make sovereign decisions about what to experience with our own consciousness while doing no harm to others, including the decision to use responsibly ancient and sacred visionary plants, then we cannot claim to be free in any way. And it's useless for our society to go around the world imposing our form of democracy on others while we nourish this rot at the heart of society and we do not allow individual freedom over consciousness. It may even be that we're denying ourselves the next vital step in our own evolution by allowing this state of affairs to continue, and who knows, perhaps our immortal destiny as well. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
With a very interesting talk that was apparently a banned TED Talk. That was Graham Hancock, The War on Consciousness. Hancock, of course, being no stranger to embracing controversial opinions and essentially doubling down on it. And I have to say that I personally find a lot of what he says to be pretty interesting. Can you poke holes in it? Well, I think you can poke holes in almost any argument at some point or another. I really like the way that he presented the Ancient Apocalypse series on Netflix. Some interesting food for thought. You don't always have to take what the guy says as gospel, but if you take what these individuals say as a stepping point to just more thought exploration of your own, then I think that there's incredible value with a lot of this. And of course, this being the Alexander Sasha Shulgin tribute show, basically a memorial show. He passed away on June 2nd, 2014. This year marked the 9th anniversary of the passing of one of the godfathers of psychedelic drugs. The man created a number of chemicals, created a wealth of information and data sets regarding usage, safe usage, and along with his wife Anne, gave a lot of interviews and presented some really fascinating information. In this following segment, where I have three various clips, it's going to wrap up with a segment from Sasha and Shulgin with the Beckley Foundation, which is sort of this group who would bring people like the Shulgins on board and have really interesting conversations. This is a snippet from one of their conversations, and it's going to be Sasha and Anne discussing phenethylamines and tryptamines. So these are the two main classes of compounds with which they worked. Things like MDMA, mescaline, being in the phenethylamine category, and substances, kind of like dimethyltryptamine, psilocybin, which is very similar to tryptamines. That's the tryptamine side of things. So they're going to be talking about that, getting a little more into the science. In the middle of the set is Sasha Shulgin in his lab. So that's him on his turf, and he's going to get scientifically geeky with this. And I think it's really important to have this aspect in the discussion. These weren't dumb people who are just saying, wow, man, I love tripping out and checking out the colors. They were trying to back up these really rarefied experiences with hard data, and I think that's pretty amazing. But we're going to get this set going with a clip from Ralph Metzner. Metzner, one of the triumvirate that worked with Timothy Leary, also with Richard Alpert, who later became Ram Dass. Metzner was part of that group from Harvard who proselytized early on for LSD, got kicked out of Harvard, but still had a long and illustrious career. This following clip is him talking about the effects of tryptamines.
I've come to sort of understand these tryptamines, especially these short-acting tryptamines. Why are they acting so shortly? Because they get metabolized very quickly and out of your system. So DMT and various relative slight changes in the molecular configuration have different effects, and there's one particular variation that I think is actually more interesting than the DMT core molecule in itself, in the sense that it's more potent for one thing. So the effective dose is like 1/10 of the effective dose of that, and it's structurally related to serotonin, as they all are, and serotonin is such a key, interesting neurotransmitter. I've come to think of it as the neurotransmitter of emotional intelligence or emotional balance, because it makes depressed people who are deficient in serotonin less depressed, and it makes angry, irritable people who are also deficient in serotonin less angry and irritable. It kind of chills them out, and people that are down and depressed, it lifts them up. So it kind of goes from the extremes to the balance place. Now, there is a syndrome of having too much serotonin, but it's relatively rare. The much more common condition is deficiency of serotonin. 40% of the American population is depressed, right? And could benefit. And people have done all these studies on delinquent people and irritability. And I've used with 5-HTP, which is an immediate serotonin precursor. And what Dennis McKenna once pointed out to me when I was we were traveling with him, and he had not tried melatonin, and I asked him to try melatonin, which is very similar to this tryptamine relative and to serotonin, and there's a DMT relative, and with just a little couple of molecules added on a side chain, and what he said is that this tryptamine DMT relative is like pulls you into superconsciousness, and the melatonin, very similar with slight molecular change, pulls you into unconsciousness, sleep. Puts you. It's a CPAL hormone that puts you into deep stage 3-4 sleep, which is very beneficent. Now people take melatonin as an anti-aging medicine because it kind of puts you into stage 3-4 sleep, which is very, very healing. All your deep internal systems are being balancing out. So I thought that was very interesting, how just a little key, slight difference in the molecular configuration. And I think of these short-acting tryptamines producing a kind of a cascading effect through triggering the pineal pituitary hypothalamic axis, then triggering all these brain centers. So all the brain centers get involved: the emotional, the mental, the perceptual, and the connections between them. And anyway, I think that's some really interesting things worth pursuing there. And actually, I wanted to mention too the work of there's this book that's been written called The Second Brain. You know about the enteric brain. I can give you the name of that too, where they've gone back to earlier research that was done in the 30s and 40s, where they used to say that in the 30s and 40s they got into the autonomic nervous system. Has these two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. But actually, originally they said there was a third. There was the enteric brain. They call it the enteric brain. There's 100 million neurons in the gut. 100 million nerve cells in the gut, in the lining and around the outside of lining of the gut. That is independent of the brain, basically, or the head and the brain. The only connection between the head brain and the gut is the vagus nerve, which has a couple of thousand fibers, not that much, compared to 100 million neurons. It's like the gut has its own brain, and it's clearly an older brain. And the neurotransmitter is, guess, serotonin.
Yeah, and ayahuasca then works through that.
That might explain. I don't know how to prove this, but it might explain why, people have this experience of throwing up, and which is a gut reaction, and then thinking more clearly, or seeing more clearly, literally seeing colors brighter, or suddenly thoughts clearer. How is that possible? Well, if it's serotonin, see, and so I think it's a fascinating area to pursue that, the interface between the nervous systems, the different levels of the nervous systems, and the hormonal, neuroendocrine kind of connections with these substances, because they metabolize so quickly. It's like I don't know what it's like. I mean, it's definitely a kind of a toxin, you see. So the body defends itself very quickly against it, but what it does it clears it out. It's sort of a clearing.
The mushrooms contain psilocybin, which hydrolyzes in the body very quickly, to psilocin, which is the active component. Some mushrooms contain the compound with only one methyl group. It's called baecysteine. There's a chemical resemblance between these materials and the neurotransmitter serotonin. It's a very interesting balance of neurotransmitter in the body to mushrooms. Namely, they are very, very similar, except that the serotonin has a hydroxy group at the 5, and psilocin has a hydroxy group at the 4 position of the indole ring. My interest in the area of psilocybin, psilocin-like materials came from my general interest in tryptamines. I've always been very keenly amazed how many of the psychoactive materials are either phenethylamines or tryptamines. I say probably 95% or more are one of these two families. And instrumental in the tryptamine world, you have DMT, which I mentioned. It's found in many, many different plants. And interestingly, although it's a Schedule I drug, it's also found in the human brain and the human spinal system. So I guess technically, if any carrier of a Schedule I drug becomes chargeable or arrestable as an illegal entity, you and I both are illegal entities because we carry it within the Schedule I drugs as natural material. Serotonin itself is an interesting relationship to the 5-methoxytryptamines. In the serotonin is active if it's in the brain, but it can't get into the brain because it is metabolized or is too polar. The amino group is hydrolyzed off by a monoamine oxidase enzyme, and the hydroxy group on the 5 position of the indole makes it too water-loving and won't get through the blood-brain barrier to get in. So serotonin, although it's active in the brain, has to go in as a precursor and is generated in the brain. So I had the idea of taking the amino group, blocking it from being hydrolyzed, putting a methyl group next to it, which would make the enzyme inactive, and block the OH group by making it a methoxy group, so again 5-methoxy things, which would take away its polarity, and the compound is, I call it O-alpha dimethylserotonin, goes into the brain directly, and it's a very potent psychedelic, active at 2, 3, 4 milligrams. So here's again, starting with serotonin and just modifying it in these little bits, gets materials that are active at the serotonin site, but have a different type of activity.
Now, one thing I don't understand, partly because I have absolutely no chemistry whatsoever, or very little. what is the difference in the essence of the experience between phenethylamines and tryptamines? For one thing, what, for instance, is a tryptamine? Give an example. I know LSD is both.
LSD does contain both.
Okay, mescaline is a phenethylamine, right?
Right.
So what? Give an example of a tryptamine. Because those are the two major
yes, it's very
categories.
interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what's
a tryptamine? Is the hand waving chalk on the blackboard kind of thing. Is not a single ring with a chain and a nitrogen out here.
Okay.
It's a double ring system. Benzene and an indole, but it's an indole thing. And it has double chain going out and stuff out there.
Okay.
It is a basically different starting structure. The tryptamines in general are a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more forceful.
Mm-hmm.
You can't modify them in the same way you modify phenethylamines. You have to. Oh no! When you put alkyl groups out there, you make phenethylamines all kinds of interesting things. You lose the activity of tryptamines sometimes.
Really?
Entirely. You get alpha methyl can change the complete world of a tryptamine. Alpha methyl enhances a phenethylamine, but alpha methyl can destroy the activity of a tryptamine.
So what do you do to get different
Put different groups elsewhere. But there is the intrinsic activity of a psychedelic. And so I modify different groups in different ways to see this intrinsic activity in its own way. But to large major phenethylamines are warm friends, and tryptamines are new friends. You don't quite know where they're going to go, and sometimes they're not warm.
Sort of tough critters in a way. Like 2CE, one of the most powerful ones, and one we call the teacher. But what is that? That's phenethylamine.
Phenethylamine, yes. Mm-hmm.
And you found that the 5 position was more effective on
That's right. The 5 position on the tryptamines is a modification, the thing that influences the whole 4 also can change it, I found.
And the tryptamines, is that DMT group? I always forget.
DMT would be the tryptamine. Yeah.
What else is a tryptamine?
Mushrooms. And mushrooms.
Psilocybe is a tryptamine? Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And what would you say off the top of your little pointed head is the difference between the mescaline experience, I mean, speaking of natural thing, mescaline experience and the psilocybin experience? For you, for instance, what characterizes the two of them? How are they different?
Mescaline to me is a warm, exploration of parts of me that I've not really had views of before.
Yeah.
It is a friend in every way.
Okay.
What was the one you had?
Psilocybe.
Psilocybe. It is a total unknown that has some weird, interesting directions to go. It's a learning thing.
Yeah.
It's a thing that allows you to explore new territory.
Okay, but it's not predictable, particularly.
Totally it does not have. You can't not call upon your experiences from the mescaline world to know where the new territory is going to be in the tryptamine world.
Okay.
It's a different world, and not negative.
Just different.
And you cannot predict it. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I have one experience with tryptamine area. There's a new area cyclic ring on the nitrogen of the indole.
Yeah.
In which I was expecting from experience, I knew all this stuff, so I can tell you, predict very well. 10 milligrams are going to be active.
Yeah.
1.5 milligrams, I was laid back on my butt. I was stoned. I was bad. In fact, I was vomiting.
Really?
So leave it alone for 2 weeks, try it again. And the second time I tried it, I was not only vomiting, but what's the other thing?
Yeah, we understand.
Yeah. Completely wrong. And that's at about 1/6 of the dosage.
Yeah.
In my experience, would say it should be active as a psychedelic.
Wow.
So apparently it had another property Yeah, another thing I never observed is in the phenethylamines.
Yeah.
It was dominant. It was there before you even get to the active psychological active level.
Right.
This physical thing was poisonous.
Okay, so.
And I got away from that one. That one went out.
Now, what's ayahuasca? Is that tryptamine?
Yeah, ayahuasca is a tryptamine.
And in what way does LSD combine the two?
A phenethylamine is a ring system down here with a chain, zigzag chain out here to a nitrogen. An indo is a ring system down here, and from the nitrogen, it's a indo ring, if I remember ring, zigzag Z to a nitrogen. So if you look at it this way, it's a phenethylamine. If you look at it this way, it's a tryptamine. It happens to be one of the
Is
few
that
things.
the only major psychedelic that's both?
Yes.
And are all psychedelics one or the other? There's no...
No, they're sneaking off into new territories now.
Right.
But basically, to me, that reducing to either phenethylamines or to tryptamines.
Right.
And as mentioned at the start of the set, that was Sasha and Anne Shulgin discussing phenethylamines and tryptamines. Sasha Shulgin in his lab before that, and Ralph Menschner talking about the effects of tryptamines before that. And now, kind of as one of our last really strong segments, this is an interesting meeting of the minds. Forgive the audio quality. This is presented mainly for the historical importance of it. You kind of have two sides of the same coin in this one. This is Terence McKenna interviewing Sasha Shulgin in 1993.
Alexander Shulgin, Sasha to his friends, is nothing less than the godfather of psychopharmacology, an expert on the cyclicized phenylethylamines, that is, psychoactive compounds useful in the emotional recovery of traumatic events. Shulgin has given his life to the study of the pharmacology of the psychedelic experience. In Prague, he told me, greater frontiers lie ahead. The next lost continent to be explored by Alexander Shulgin, the psychoactive tryptamines. Sasha suggested that I join him for a stroll among the graves of the cemetery of the Jewish ghetto of Prague, Europe's oldest ghetto. There, walking among the stones, we reminisced and speculated about the history and the future of psychopharmacology. What do you make of your Russian colleagues here?
I'm fascinated by what he's doing, and I'm intrigued by his ability to get out what he is doing into the West, because the status of a physician in Russia is not what we have come to respect in the West.
You're talking about Yevgeny Krupinski.
Yes.
I imagine you don't view ketamine with... Well, how do you view ketamine?
It's an anesthetic, and it's a dissociative thing, and it puts me out of body.
It's very dissociative. It puts me out of mind.
Just you're away, and I, frankly, with a full bladder, like being here. And you suddenly realize that someone has a full bladder, and at only one intellectual level you realize it's you.
Yes. No, it's so seriously disassociated me that I felt it was a great victory when I finally realized that this was a drug. For a long time I couldn't figure out what it was or who was even asking the question.
They kept calling it vitamin K, which is a fascinating euphemism for allowing to have some semblance of a food additive for a dietary supplement. But
well,
I had the interesting pleasure of being back at a big company in the East the day they had bought the rights to distribute ketamine. And I informed them, you do realize that ketamine is being made by Park Davis and shipped off to Mexico. It's imported in liter bottles, all with a percentage of preservative, and it comes right back into California in the trunk of the car. And they were shocked. They did not know there was any abuse whatsoever.
Never could have conceived of human abuse.
About 20 years ago, there's a class of compounds called quincucliidines. And for about 3 or 4 years, I just noticed that there's no publishing in the Russian literature whatsoever on the area of quincucliidines. Then all of a sudden, the Russian literature started publishing. And then we went into a sort of a gap. And then quincucliidine benzylate, which is one of the most potent of the anticholinergics, was suddenly revealed that the Russians were working on it as a chemical warfare agent. And then we were working on as a defense against their chemical warfare agent. And it's actually 10, 20 micrograms.
10, 20 micrograms.
It makes you really wonky. It's like atropine. Delusion, confusion. But they design these fantastic bombs that they can explode and send out millions of little hypodermic needles. And so they don't have to worry about wind blowing it downwind or upwind.
So it's essentially a chemical cluster bomb.
Cluster bomb, but with little hypodermic needles. Yeah, elegant.
So that's probably in the inventory.
It's already in the inventory.
Well, someone mentioned to me that you had expressed interest now that you felt you had sort of done the work you wanted to do with cyclicized phenylethylamines and that you were going back to looking at tryptamine.
Very much so. That's the other side of the coin. It's as rich and unexplored areas that phenethylamines were 20 years ago.
So are you going to illuminate it for us?
Oh, absolutely. I've already made the T-butyl methyl, isopropyl methyl is well known, but the secondary butyl methyl is not known. They're all active by smoking.
And what are they, could you, in a blind test, pick one out from another, or are they sort of...
I don't know yet. I doubt it somehow. I think they're all going to be fast, impactful, and all very much like DMT.
Duration-wise, or presentation-wise?
Probably perhaps a little bit more potent.
A little bit more potent?
DMT is not that all-fired potent. It takes, 10, 20, 50, no more, 50, 100 milligrams.
50 to 70
and some of these we're getting into maybe at 30, 20 and 30 milligrams, but not active oil. You have to get up to a certain degree of shrubbery on the nitrogen to get oil activity.
And how many of these compounds do you imagine there are that are simple
casually
variants?
You can make 30, 40, 50.
Why do you suppose it is that this fast-acting, easily manufactured, spectacular hallucinogen is so rarely met in the underground?
I don't know. I've heard that it's there in some quantity. I heard about a seizure in Boston, I believe it was of ayahuasca. And they seized it on the basis that it contained DMT.
Right, that was the Santo Daime people from Brazil. But, we live in a society where people jump out of airplanes and hang by bungee cords over bridges. And DMT, which is always described as an easy synthesis,
it is extremely easy.
Is just not there. I have no idea. It violates one of these economic laws.
Basic laws.
Gresham or Graham or somebody. Something that I've always wanted to ask you, which is, unlike me, you seem remarkably resistant to what I call the implications. I mean, how can you just do these things over and over again and not be nutty as a fruitcake?
So?
Well, are you?
I think I relaxed in any event.
But unlike me, you don't feel the need to rave about that aspect of it.
Not particularly. I'd rather quietly stay half in the closet and continue doing what I'm doing.
But you've probably seen more uncharted internal landscape than half of mankind put together. I mean, that would not be an immodest claim.
They're a little bit charted now.
Well, a very little bit.
Very little, that's right. But the seeds are there to be used by anyone else. That's the reason for the book, just to get it all recorded into a documented form.
But it always puzzles me. I mean, I think Hoffman and Wasson, and certainly to some degree Schultes, to some degree you, everybody says, well, I'm just a humble botanist, or I'm just a hard-working workbench chemist. Nobody wants to actually say, this must be very, very important. Because it's so uniquely beyond ordinary expectation.
Yes, but the importance is going to take a long time to realize. What you can't build without the tools, and you have to have the tools, and these are the tools that allow the building to be done. I'm not a builder. I'm a tool maker. And that's probably one of the reasons I've not described a lot of landscapes. Others see them differently.
If we could compare it to the invention of the telescope, probably within 50 years of the invention of the telescope, the major solar system new paradigms were put in place. This seems very elusive. It seems hard for us to go beyond simply saying it exists, it's really far out, and then we sort of fall silent. What do you think about that?
I think the silence is in part imposed upon us by a very unsympathetic authority body. And maybe it's just as well, because that way a lot of work can be done and sort of recorded for posterity. And the time the pendulums swing, they will swing back. And the time will come when this work will be used, research will be done with these tools that will be created.
Well, obviously you believe in it strongly. What would you say to a critic who said, what's so great about this? Are you and your friends in any significant way different from the rest of humanity?
No. And I don't see why I would be critical. I'm not offending him. I can see no way in which I'm offending him. I'm quietly doing my little alchemist thing at home.
But you really must think that it does make a difference.
I think it does. I think it will.
It will.
I don't think it does now.
So we really are cursed with being pioneers.
Yeah.
It's not so bad.
No,
it's not so bad.
It has a nice
I mean, they'll hang your picture in the main hall years hence and say, these were giants.
I would rather have my picture hanging in the main hall than me hanging in the
Well, some people manage both.
That's true.
And you may end up that way, too.
Oh, well, it's a short, happy life. It's kind of neat.
Well,
but this is your territory, too. What's your feeling? Do you feel that that's a fair...
I think that I have always, from the very first psychedelic experience, had the uncanny intuition that, yes, this has been around for 50,000 years, but it's somehow going to be critically important in our lifetime, that we will need it for something, maybe just to think our way out of the mess that we're getting into.
Okay. But if it's needed, we have it.
Yes.
That's the beauty. The tool is there for the time when the need is obvious. And this may be our lifetime.
So essentially what you're doing is you're placing tools on the shelf. Mm-hmm. Screwdrivers for screws that haven't been invented yet.
Exactly that. Except it's a good tool. Its use will depend upon someone who has that particular view of need.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a wonderful thing. Where do you hope to be in 10 years or so with all of this?
Probably starting on a third book.
Do you think, I know you're working on a book about legalization and...
Not actually. I'm working with a group who is more or less funded to make arguments that would be raised, to address arguments to be raised in a legalization process. What would be the answer of how drugs would be legalized? How would they be made available? Should it be an open supermarket? It should be under some sort of governmental control. And it's a research, more than that, a policy group
study
setting up for that. I think it's futile in the present state.
In terms of practical impact.
I don't think anyone's going to seriously entertain legalization. So it may be a futile process, but it's a fun process. Because in the process you begin evaluating your own relationship to drug law, drug regulation, drug control.
If you were in charge of it, how do you see it happening? I mean, are there drugs you would keep legal, or do you think it should be...
What I would do if I were running, I would keep certain laws that would protect people of innocence. I would have absolutely no drug with children who are of too young an age. God knows what that is, maybe.
16, 18, 21.
Maybe the alcohol model.
Right.
Absolutely unallowed giving drugs to anyone without their consent.
Naturally.
Informed consent, knowledge, education. I would make absolutely available at all levels about propaganda, restriction, information that is factual about drugs. Then I'd open the drugstore. And you people, will they overuse? Maybe. But I think that would very quickly dampen itself out to maybe about what we have now. But you will remove the criminality, remove the violence, remove the entire social disruptiveness that these drug laws have caused.
would you encourage the government to see these drugs as a vehicle for gaining tax revenue, or do you think the government should stay off that?
Probably some tax revenue would be valid, as with other drugs of abuse, other things of abuse.
Similarly to alcohol and tobacco.
It's a good model, and perhaps it's a valid one.
Well, that's pretty much what I suggested in my book, but I agree with you that it's easy to sit down and come up with a fine plan, overcoming the political hurdles of an American...
Too many people have too much to benefit on the laws being what they are and even becoming more intense. And until you change that motivation, that reward.
Yes, well, the most cynical and the most naive people in America are keeping the drug problem going. The most cynical by dealing and importing drugs, and the most naive through the kind of Christian terror of...
Look at the monstrous industries that have been built up with it. The drug urine screening, shameful.
Right.
But they're multi-billion-dollar things. This kit, that GCMS, this instrumentation, these people who make little wax urine bottles. It's becoming, there's no justification for urine screening at any time of anyone under any circumstance on a random basis.
Well, and the notion that in a democratic society people would get into that kind of thing is incredible, I think.
It's completely contrary to the principles of that society. The assumption of innocence. We blew it because it's not in the Constitution.
Right.
It should have been in it, but it wasn't.
Right.
But taking a urine sample on a random basis is an assumption of guilt.
Well, but what is in the Bill of Rights is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Declaration of Independence. But that could be used as a sufficient basis
it's a
for...
self-image, and we should maintain it as such.
Yeah, well, the first thing that goes when society hits the wall is democracy.
An interesting, strolling conversation between Terence McKenna and Sasha Shulgin, going all the way back to 1993 for that one. Hard to believe that that's 30 years ago, although given the audio quality, it definitely sounded like that. And with that, everybody, we're drawing this Alexander Shulgin memorial episode to a close. I hope a lot of you found something of use in this particular one. We didn't play a lot of music tonight, but I think that was all right. Hopefully these clips were informative. I had to whittle it down big time in order to fit this in, so expect shows on this topic in the future. In the meantime, let's let a track from the Talking Heads play us out tonight. From the Talking Heads, this is a song called Drugs.
I'm charged up. Don't put me down.
And that's it for Pop Your Culture for this week. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to tune in to this interesting audio journey. I want to thank CHIR FM and Radio Gordo for allowing this to go out on their airwaves. Until next time you want to get informed about this world of pop culture that we're so deeply immersed inside of. Well, you all be cool, and we'll meet up next time. Later.